Hi everybody, I'm Alister Benn and you're watching Expressive Photography. Thank you for joining me and coming back to the channel. This week I want to look at a really important topic, which is how to self-critique, how to look at your own photographs with that kind of objective eye that allows you to evaluate them, not just from a technical point of view, but also from a creative and aesthetic point of view. One of the big problems with image critique is an awful lot of it becomes opinion. Someone will say, oh, well, I would do this, or I would do that, or maybe you should do that, and it would be better if you did this. And an awful lot of that is basically saying, I wouldn't have done it that way, and if you do it this way, I will like the photo more. Now, is that image critique, or is it just channeling you into their preference? And I think this is a big danger with image critiques, and I see this an awful lot out there in the world. I've even spoken to other professional photographers who, when I say to them, well, how do you critique images? And they say, well, I just tell them to correct it until it looks the way I would do it, and then it's right. That is not critique, that is just opinion. So what we're going to do today is we're actually going to dive into my Lightroom catalog, have a look at a raw file, and then the finished image. Now this is an image I made a couple of years ago, so my opinions may have changed. So I'm going to try and objectively look at the photograph as a raw file and then as a finished photograph and critique it and hopefully show you some of the steps that you can take to critique your own images that allow you to have a better understanding of the types of things that are we could consider failures of execution or flaws that can be corrected from an objective point of view versus creative choices, creative decisions, expressive decisions, aesthetic decisions, ways of articulating yourself decisions. And those can be a little bit harder, but we're going to cover both of those things in this video. So make sure you carry on watching right to the end, because hopefully all of it's going to be interesting for you. I think it's very easy when we start out to be inspired and somewhat we self-judge based on other people's work. We're always looking at other people's photographs and thinking, well, my photos suck a little bit because they don't look as good as that person's photographs. And this is part of the learning process. 22 years ago, when I started making digital photographs again after a huge break, I didn't know anything about photography. I didn't know what exposure was. I didn't know what aperture was. I knew very little, and I certainly hadn't heard of Photoshop. So most of my development over the last 22 years has been a learning curve based on comparing myself to other people and learning some of this stuff as I've been going along. And it takes a long time. So part of the reason for this video is to try and make it faster for you. I don't want you to have to wait 22 years to understand how to critique your own photographs. I want you to learn how to do that today. So let's just dive into Lightroom here. And this is a photograph I took back in 2019, I think it was, on the north coast of Spain while I was running a workshop there. And this is the raw file. Not a single thing has been done to it. And let's start looking at all the various things that we want to look at. Now, I shot this natively as a 16:9 crop in camera. I was using my Laowa 12mm prime lens, which is why in the information up here, it doesn't show the focal length or aperture. It's a manual lens and therefore the camera doesn't read that, but it does tell me that I did 20-second exposure and used ISO 31, which is the lowest my camera will go. There's a couple of things that stand out clearly. First of all, when we look at the histogram here, if we hit the J key, we turn on and off clipping, and you can see there that there's a little bit of shadow clipping there in the right hand side of the frame. Now, I used my case ND filters and my neutral density filters here to create this file in a single exposure. You can see that we have a large expanse of bright sky. This is near sunset on the left hand side there, and we have deep shadowy cliffs on the right hand side. I used a grad to balance the exposure between the foreground and the sky, but what that has done is it's overly darkened that top right hand corner. That objectively is something that we can fix. There's no right or wrong about this, and there's nothing wrong with having clipped blacks, particularly on images that are going to be shown on the web. But when it comes time to print, if we print out images with clipped blacks or clipped highlights, that has an impact on how the ink is put down on the paper, and you can end up with either very heavy sections of massive amounts of ink or areas of the frame that have no ink. And that's really why we take care of clipping. In the final photograph, there is no clipping, and that is something I would fix personally. I don't mind having black blacks, but I don't want clipped blacks. There's another couple of things we can see here. There's a few little water spots and a couple of little sensor spots. If I use the view spots, visualize spots here with that little checkbox, it's a really good way to show where sensor spots are. Now, oddly, my camera was fairly clean at this point, but there are a couple of sensor spots in here, and there is also this water splash. It was quite windy, and because with a 12mm lens, you're really quite close to the water, there was splashes coming up every time a wave came in, and this is just a byproduct of shooting by the ocean. So objectively, there are a few things we have to look at. Sensor spots, I think, is a really important one. The second one is I don't have any lens corrections automatically selected when I import files. It's something I always do for each individual image. This because it's a lens that doesn't have a profile loaded into Lightroom, doesn't have lens correction, so there's no barrel distortion correction or anything like that. Thankfully, there doesn't seem to be an awful lot here, but I would always check to make sure the horizon was level, and in this case it is pretty level. I don't think if you're photographing seascapes or horizons that are quite flat, that having them at an angle is generally something that we want to do. I think it's better to present them as a level thing, unless you have a very strong reason for doing otherwise, like abstracting it or something like that. A little bit off level is usually an oversight. A huge amount off level may be considered a creative statement for whatever reason that might be. So from a technical point of view, is it sharp? That's the first thing that I really want to check here. The foreground is pretty sharp. The background is acceptably sharp. It's a little soft. I would have shot this with a fairly small aperture. This Laowa lens is really, really good for depth of field, but this image, as far as I'm concerned, is acceptably sharp. When we look at the world, it is not tack sharp front to back. You look 5 miles into the distance and tell me that you can see every single tree tack sharp, then you should be flying fighter jets, because most people don't see the world to that level of detail. I take my glasses off and I can barely see the camera in front of me. In fact, I can't. Sharpness should be a consideration, but it shouldn't be the most important thing. By the time a print is on the wall and it's being looked at from across the room, you are not looking at individual pixels to see how sharp they are. It's the overall impression. That is what art is. It's not about perfection. So we have an acceptable degree of sharpness. We don't have any major distractions, although there are, like I said, a couple of these, a water droplet here and there and the odd sensor spot here and there. And the horizon has been considered to be level. That is pretty much, from a technical point of view, the types of things that we want to be looking at and objectively making sure are correct. If you post an image online and there's sensor spots all over it, or even worse, if you send it off to a print lab and it comes back and there's sensor spots all over it, you should be kicking yourself. Set the bar high for attention to detail would be the best thing to suggest. The next thing are more sort of compositional things. You can see off on the left-hand side there's a little bit of rocks out in the ocean that are creeping in there. That is something that I would consider to be a distraction. Where this rock is getting quite close to the edge of the frame, we have to think about the impact of that. There are no major white blotchy marks around the edge of the frame. Sometimes I will tidy those types of things up, because when I talk about luminosity, contrast, color, atmosphere, and geometry, all 5 of those things have a massive impact on how we notice things in a frame. This lens, this little water droplet there, is a patch of luminosity. It's not a water droplet. We don't see it as a water droplet. We see it as luminosity, and it will attract our attention. There's even a little bit of a rainbow in it because of the way it's catching the light. So it's got color and luminosity, but more importantly, it's creating contrast against this rock, which is such an important rock in the composition. I think it's probably best now to move to the Word file, which you will see is significantly more colorful than the raw file was, and that's just because that color detail was in the frame, it was in the raw file, but the neutralizing impact of a lot of raw file converters, and that was a very flat profile, so it was made to look flat and boring. But by bringing out a little bit of contrast, it's not difficult to bring color back into these scenes. So what I've done here, you will see in terms of the processing, a few of the little things we need to check are, I've pulled in the composition a little bit and zoomed in a little bit actually, and now looking at it objectively, I consider that rock to maybe be a tiny bit tight on that left hand side, because that is like having a conversation with someone and their face is there and you're just really, really close in. It's adding a little bit of tension. Is it a deal breaker? Probably not. What would happen if I cloned it out? I don't know. We'd have to find out. But at the end of the day, what I'm seeing here are very few distractions. So there are no white blotchy marks on the rocks. But most importantly, what I've tried to do is to create a feeling of depth and three-dimensionality by making sure that the foreground feels close to the front of the camera, and then allowing the cooling of the sky to help with that distancing into the background there. Let's have a look at the clipping. So with the J key activated, there is no clipping. It's showing a little bit. So there's a little white triangle which shows me there part of it. So maybe one of the 3 channels might be clipped. Probably the blue channel is probably clipped. So if I grab this, yeah, we can change the temperature a little bit, but yeah, it's not really, but I don't think the clipping is enough to cause any major problems there. The important thing is we get to a point in a photograph when we're processing photographs that we just have to accept that this is one version and that it's not carved in stone. The difficulty with this is that I would look at this photograph now, 3 years after it was taken, 3 years after it was processed, and maybe I would process it differently today. I could definitely start with the raw file and produce a different photograph. I might produce a black and white photograph. I might produce something that's less colorful or cooler. There's all of these different variables. But the key with self-critique is, what are you trying to say? Yeah. Now, obviously, with this image here, it's quite an unusual location actually, because you kind of go down some steps, very steep steps onto the beach, and you're just instantly in this cavern of cliffs. And if you were to go along to this particular spot on an incoming tide, you would be trapped and could die. You know, it's that type of location. So it's a very intimidating place. Massive cliffs that are towering over you, maybe 100 feet. So it's a really, really intimidating place. And on the right-hand side, there's a cave. So there's a very strong sense that you're kind of trapped in a corner. Now, of course, when I take clients to this location, we go on a falling tide, and you've actually got to wait until you can kind of get around little promontories. You've got to wait and sort of run around between waves, and as long as the tide's going out, you're safe. Tide's coming in, bad thing to do. So there is a sense when you're in this place that you're a little bit vulnerable. You know, it preys on our fears, it preys on our insecurity. So keeping the right-hand side of the image dark like that, I want that to feel threatening. I want there to be a sense of dread. I want there to be a sense of mystery. And that is why the right-hand side is kind of heavy and kind of dark, because dark, heavy things make us feel heavy and dark. The left-hand side of the frame as a complete counterpoint. We've got all this ocean, we've got this wide open space, we've got this beautiful sunset light. It's uplifting, it's emotional, it's therapeutic. It makes us think of the sound of running water in a Zen garden. All of these things are amazing. And if I was to grab the crop tool and go in with a 4x5, we have a completely different photograph. We've taken away some of the dread, we've taken away a lot of the mystery, and the photograph becomes a much more open and emotionally open photograph. This is what self-critique is all about, is understanding what are you trying to say. Certain parts of the frame are going to bring to the equation, they're going to bring to the aesthetic a mood or a feel. This is now all bright and airy and open, and with a little bit of heaviness on the right hand side, but not enough to really influence. The vast majority of this photograph is lighter, long exposure on the water, so it's very ethereal and very atmospheric. We've got lightness in the sky, we've got beautiful colors in the sky. So the impact of everything we do has a consequence. If I go back to the original frame, it suddenly feels heavy, it suddenly feels dark and imposing. These are perfectly okay things. You can make 2 photographs. You can make as many different photographs of this scene as you possibly want, and each one will have a different feel. And one of the important things with self-critique is we do not need to beat ourselves up and say, oh, it's not perfect, I'm now thinking of something else. I was speaking to someone the other day and they were saying quite often they just keep going back to photographs and keep going back to photographs, or the same photograph, and every time they go they're tinkering with it and changing it, and they're never satisfied. And that is a very, very big problem. So what I would recommend to you is don't beat yourself up. Photography should be an enjoyable process. Photography should be about expressing something. But understand that you are not constant. We don't have to be the same. We don't always have to make photographs in the same style, in the same way. So as it stands at the moment, I really like this foreground here with the beautiful rocks, with the water over them and all the luminosity and the roundness. And there's something very beautiful about this part of the foreground. In fact, you know, there's an awful lot to be said that, you know, something like that is in its own right a beautiful photograph. But it's important for us to realize that the photograph I made 3 years ago was what I wanted to say at the time. That was the way it was processed. That is what I expressed, whether I posted it online or whatever, I don't know. But the important thing is we need to split our own image critique into 2 things. There are technical flaws or technical considerations, and then there are creative and expressive considerations. The technical considerations can have an impact on the creative and articulate side of things. If you have sensor spots all over the place, that becomes a distraction. If you have water droplets all over the place, that can become a distraction. If the horizon isn't level, that can become a distraction. And it's a real shame if you put so much effort and energy into making a creative statement, making a photograph that you want to share with other people, and its impact is reduced because of distractions. Something else we also have to consider here are things like over-processing artifacts. So for example, cranking up the clarity until it becomes aggressively contrasty. You can see now we've created halos between the shadows and the highlights. We've created all of this horrible crunch on the foreground rocks there. And don't forget that adding a little bit of detail and contrast and clarity can be a good thing, particularly if we want to add attention to foregrounds. But I would do it as a local adjustment rather than a global adjustment. So if I add a little bit of crunchy contrast to the front with the clarity slider, the foreground bright, the whiteness of the water increases, the details in the rocks increases, it feels closer. That is a good thing to do. I can actually take another gradient here and bring it down from the top, and let's just open up those shadows a tiny little bit. And I'm actually going to do the unthinkable and take clarity away from the top there. So what I've done is I've opened up that top right hand corner. It's less oppressive than it was, and that has a consequence. Think about your self-critique as an assessment of the consequences that you're putting into the frame. You can't stick a post-it note over an area of the frame saying, do not look here, do not feel this, do not notice this. That's not the way we're allowed to use photography. Everything within the frame is there to be seen. Everything that's in the frame will be noticed by somebody. So attention to detail of the technicals. Grabbing the saturation slider and cranking it too far to the right hand side is going to make distracting, oversaturated things that take away from the expressive nature of the photograph. Understand that sometimes less is more. Understand that sliders go in both directions. All of these things are going to help you with your self-critique. At the end of the day, critique is about taste. It is your preference. When you don't know any better, you can somehow be forgiven for certain things in photography processing. Pushing everything up to 11 when you don't understand that that has a consequence on how someone is going to read your photograph is a very easy thing to rectify. So what I would suggest to you is that don't try to put yourself in a corner with a final version of a photograph. Accept that all that is a snapshot in time. In fact, it can be really, really good to walk out of your studio or your office or your wherever it is you process your images and just go out for half an hour and come back. And the first thing that you notice about the photograph is the next thing you need to be sorting out. Is it too dark? Is it too contrasty? Is it too saturated? Is it too blue? Is it too warm? You're going to get a feel for that. One final thing I just want to mention when it comes to processing is having transitions in photographs is a really, really great way to allow people to explore the frame. We have warm to cool, we've got dark to light, we've got high contrast to atmosphere. We've got round things to jagged, angular things. There's all sorts of transitions going on in this photograph, and I think it makes it quite an engaging shot to look at. Self-critique is probably the most important thing that you can learn, to understand that your preferences, your choices, your intention, your articulation are very personal to you. Listening to someone who says you should do this, 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 and this to make your photo better isn't going to allow you to find your way of doing things any more than someone walking into my office and saying, I really hate the music you're listening to, put this on instead, and it's something that I don't like, but you listen to it to make them happy. That is not helping me with my preference, to understand my preferences and my aesthetic preferences and my emotional preferences. I hope you found this little rant about this photograph on the north coast of Spain to be useful. One of the reasons I've kind of brought up critiquing is that Adam Gibbs and I are going to be critiquing your photographs over the coming weeks. So in the notes at the bottom of this video, you will see different ways to submit your photographs to us, and we can hopefully choose some of those, and we'll be bringing some of these videos to you in the coming weeks. Thank you very much for watching. One final thing, my pre-sale for the book is still available. If you have not bought your copy of Out of Darkness, I can assure you it is an incredibly high quality product and is the absolute focus of my creative life right now. The whole concept of expressive photography was born out of that, and my relationship with my mental health and the person who I've become is a function of everything I threw into that book and the experiences I had in the Gobi Desert. You're supporting us immensely by buying our products, and we very much appreciate it. So thank you very much. And if anybody wants to dive in and buy one of our books, the link is also at the bottom of this video. We'll see you again next week. Autumn is here. We're going to be diving out into the landscape more and more in the coming weeks, and I look forward to bringing you some stuff that's taken outside rather than just inside. Thanks for watching again. Tune in next week for more expressive photography, and yeah, happy shooting wherever you are. Bye for now.